All right, so welcome to today's class. We are going to talk about developing a cyber protection plan, and that terminology is I think it's always hard to hammer down like what we would call these things. Typically, when we're talking about developing the administrative side of cybersecurity in an organization, we talk about starting with a policy, and so generally cyber protection plan and security policy, cybersecurity policy, or kind of a foundational security policy that you have in your business is what we'll be kind of talking about here today and helping you get a better idea of how to build this in your organization. So we are going to we're going to start with getting in the mindset. I'll give you an overview real quick first. I was in the Air Force for 12 years, and they beat in your head that you tell everybody what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So it's kind of a one of those things that sticks in your head from giving briefings and presentations in the military, at least in the Air Force. But we'll talk kind of get in the mindset. This is one of the things that I find is very important because a lot of people come in and think about security in a not kind of a correct or a full way. And I just had a discussion with an attorney friend this morning on this, and the way they address something, I could tell that even though we've known each other for many years, and they actually are probably one of the most cyber knowledgeable attorneys in Central Arkansas, it's still a hard hurdle to get over. Next, we'll talk about having an initial security assessment, kind of getting your baseline, getting an understanding of where you are, and then we'll start building out how you want to build your security program within your organization. We'll start by finding a source security framework, and then we'll take that and we'll customize those controls. And then we'll talk about how do we implement those controls that you've customized and designed. And then we'll talk about the need for this to be a living function. You just don't do it once and consider everything good. All right, so starting with the mindset. And first and foremost, one thing I don't have on here is we're at the point, if any of you were in the original kind of building a business securely, the intro class to this whole series, I talked about that you can start things as a small business owner or a startup owner, or when you're very, very early in the process. You can kind of start things on your own, and you have to in a certain way, because you wear all the hats in the business, you wear all the hats in any organization that's brand new. But at a certain point, you need to call and get help. It's kind of the idea of you brush your teeth every day, but you still go to the dentist every 6 months or annually to get a checkup and make sure you don't have cavities and fill any cavities. Eventually do crowns and root canals and all that kind of stuff. So it's sort of a shared responsibility. We're at the point when you're building this kind of portion of your organization out that you're probably a little bit larger, and it would really help you to get someone from the outside that has some more knowledge about risk management, cyber risk management specifically, not just the technical side of the house, but also what we're talking about from a physical security, administrative policy process kind of things as well, managing people, stuff like that. So it's not just about the technical side, and we'll look through that as we're going through some of these controls today. But next up, keep in mind that we're managing risks here. We're not just installing software. This isn't about picking out from a Chinese menu of what software packages that you're going to install that are going to do all the work for you. We are managing risk. We're worried about access to mostly information for most businesses, but we've got a growing group of folks that also have to pay attention to the security of the systems themselves. And so when we're talking about managing risk of information, again, we're talking about the confidentiality, the integrity of sensitive information. We are, excuse me, we're also from a system standpoint, we're talking about the confidentiality and integrity, or the limited access and proper access to systems that are managing physical actions in the world, like controlling power grids or managing medical devices that may be implanted into the bodies of patients, or handling HVAC in a building or something like that. So we're getting more and more out of the information world only and also into the physical world here too. So we are going well beyond just what software do we install, what antivirus and what firewall do I need. It's a whole heck of a lot more complicated than that. We also want to be very careful in the requirements that we're implementing. You can go 100% to the security side of the world, but you won't be able to operate your business or operate your organization if you have too draconian of requirements to put into place here. So you do have to be careful. I always talk about the decision between security and operations is not a switch, it's a slider. You have to find the appropriate level on the slider, and that appropriate level might be at different points for different topics. So you have to be very, very smart and very plugged in when you're doing this. Also, from the last time we talked about different ways to manage risk, and prevention is the only thing that we have out there. We can also mitigate. So when we talk about prevention, we're talking about remediation. So that's kind of all the risk goes away. But we also have other options like mitigation, where we reduce the risk. Maybe we reduce it to an acceptable level, and then we just accept the remaining risk. So if you've got a risk topic out there and you say, well, I can reduce this risk by 70%, then that remaining 30% may be more palatable for you to go, well, we can live with that. So you have that option. Risk acceptance is another one of those two, and that can be paired up. Or maybe that risk wasn't very much in the first place, so we just accept all of the risk. We also have risk transference. So you can do this through buying insurance. You can do this through picking a different solution. Maybe instead of picking an on-premises solution to your needs, you can pick a cloud-based solution. So you transfer a good portion of the management risk of that system. So the servers, the power supply, the physical security aspects can be transferred to a cloud provider instead of all of it being taken on by your organization. And then we have risk avoidance as the last one. If it's just too risky, we can not do that line of business or not do that activity or something along those lines. We want to also use whatever resources are available, and that's kind of the mindset that we're going through when we're talking about this today. We're going to be using industry best practice resources to build our security policy or protection plan from. And this goes very much along with the get help, get somebody out there. There's people like us that have been doing this for many years and can come in and advise you to say, okay, I know you think this is the way you want to go, but I promise you, I just worked with 6 other businesses that made the same mistake. So you want to take option 2 instead of option 1 there, or looking in your business and saying, hey, you really need to shore this up because this is more of a risk for you than it is for somebody else. So we'll be looking at this kind of from a how do we design these controls and how do we pick these controls? And we're not creating these out of thin air. We're actually using government and industry groups that have done this work before us and using their work, kind of standing on the shoulders of giants here. And then you have to realize that security is always changing. This year it's different than last year. Last year was different than the year before. Next year it will be different than this year. And sometimes that change is a whole 180-degree turn. Sometimes that change is just a slight deviation. So you have to be aware of that environment and what your threats are and what the technology and acceptable solutions and kind of industry thought is in how you manage that risk or how you counter that risk regularly. And again, just to stomp that foot one more time, this is a great reason that having someone who does this for a living as an advisor or as a employee is a good idea, to have someone who's knowledgeable about this and you're not just guessing at that. Okay. Oops, sorry. Of course, it's Monday. My phone is blowing up like crazy. So, all right. So first, getting a little further, and kind of in the lieu of the mindset, we need to determine our scope. And now I kind of worked a little bit and was thinking a little bit of how I would put this in here and how I would group this with the other portions of this. And scope is really part of that mindset in understanding what you must secure and what you can secure. And so that kind of goes here with, what are your assets? What do you have? And your assets can be different things from, a computer system that you own that's sitting on your desk to a cloud service that you have purchased and you have some level of management control that's in the cloud, but you don't have any physical ownership of that at all. You're just effectively leasing these services from that cloud vendor. When it's very easy to think of what is in your control when you think of that physical computer that's sitting on your desk or that server that's in a closet in your office building somewhere. But it's a little bit different when you're thinking about, oh, I have a service or I have a piece of software from a vendor, but I don't really own that. It's all just digital. And it might not even be, anywhere physically near you, but you do have some level of control over how that's configured, how that's used, how you interface with it, and things like that. So you really have to think about that from kind of from a broad brush concept there to understand what is truly an asset that I have, but also what's the scope of my control with each of these assets. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go forward, because some of these cloud services, like if you have an Office 365 or Microsoft or a workspace from Google, you have quite a bit of control over the configuration of those. However, if you have something like QuickBooks Online or FreshBooks, you have a lot less control over those environments than you do the previous. And then also you need to think about what your threats are. A lot of times when we first take on a new client from a security perspective, they just know what they hear and they're scared of everything. And so some construction company in Central Arkansas is worried about the Chinese hacking into their computers. And it's like, look, for the most part, the Chinese aren't concerned with your systems. Their threat model is to go after U.S. government and U.S. government contractor systems. So that's not your primary worry there. Let's shift and think about what are your true threats. And you can determine those by understanding your industry, understanding the size of your company. And there are other characteristics as well. Industry and company size are pretty easy to understand, but other characteristics like, are you a heavily cloud-based company? Do you rely mostly on systems that are in your office or on premises? And those are going to have different kind of threat constructs that go along with those. So you need to understand how you're building or how you have built your information infrastructure to understand more about what those threats are. And every time we do a security assessment for clients, and when we do these, most of the time they're very kind of large security assessments that go into pretty great depth, depending on what sort of underlying requirements are in place. But in any of these, we'll do a threat assessment, and we recommend that they take that threat assessment and they build upon that in their security policy so that they better understand that. We kind of give them that seed to start the process, but then they need to go expand that if necessary and maintain that year to year so they understand what is the true threat, so they know what they're countering against. Kind of the regular world corollary to that would be, oh, I have an illness. Well, I don't know what illness I have, so I'll just take every medicine possible. Could you imagine just sitting there eating pills after pills after pills, not knowing how you are sick, but expecting, that not to have some secondary effect or some other negative effect on you. So if you're going out and trying to counter every cyber threat imaginable, you're probably spending a lot more money, doing a lot more work, and hindering your business a lot more than if you actually understood how to pinpoint that a little better. And you're not ever going to be perfect. This is very much a educated guess when we do this, but it does help focus your efforts instead of just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. All right, any questions on that so far before we jump into actually doing the work? All right. So as I mentioned in the overview, kind of the first thing that we need to do is understand where we are at this moment. And it's, you can go in and start building out your policy and everything ahead of this, but it really helps to have an understanding of where your strengths and weaknesses are. A lot of times, if you're doing this initial assessment, you're choosing, do I do it internally or do it externally? Most of the time, a lot of small businesses are just thinking externally. But internally is an option if you have at least some expertise or even something to go on there. Typically, I recommend if you're looking at this, if you're first time out, then get somebody to come in that knows what they're doing, that knows what they're looking at. And then after that, you can repeat that a few more times internally before you go back out to external to kind of have a recentering of your expectations. As if you go external, it does end up costing some money. Depending on who you get to do your external assessment, that could be very expensive. A lot of times, companies outside the state of Arkansas are going to charge, New York, California kind of fees, and so that's going to be a bit prohibitively expensive to companies that live in a state with a lower cost of doing business. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at this. There's kind of options for both, but you got to do it in the right order and kind of with the right routine there. Externally, you've got ACDC available to you free until August based on their SBA grant. But there are other third parties around that do that as well. And I say that kind of, definitely if this is your first time out, ACDC is a good route to go. They have built their assessments based on one of the documents that we'll use here, which is a very well trusted source of kind of security guidance. So, but just know that if that is no longer free after August, then there are other options out there as well. And even when we do assessments for clients, if we come in for kind of an assessment only client, my recommendation is usually use different vendors each time so that you get a different view of things, kind of like getting a second opinion from a different doctor if you don't necessarily agree with what the first one tells you. Some caveats to go along with doing this externally. They won't always meet all of your needs. And as I mentioned, ACDC uses one of the documents we'll use, the Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls, which are great. And I highly recommend building your policy off of those. But as a framework, kind of a blank framework that doesn't always get to the core of your needs. It's more of a one size fits all for everybody in the industry. And we work cyber in the cyber industry. The people that research these and build these out work very hard to make them work well for all organizations, but there's always gaps. They're not going to be perfect for you. But even with that, don't let that scare you away. Think of that, whatever you get, especially that first time around, as a seed to your program. So you can get that assessment and you can see kind of how well you stack up against these kind of very generic industry recommendations, and then you can build out on your strengths and your weaknesses when you're knocking all of this out. And after you have a defined plan or policy in place, then you can call on those assessors who will assess to what your policy says. So if you have, something that specifically says, here's our requirements, then they can assess to those requirements as well, and potentially even guide you to say, hey, look, this is your requirement, but that's not quite strong enough, or that's not the right way to go. I can make I can advise you in this, which is kind of what we'll do. If somebody has a very specific requirement that says something like must have a 7-character password, we'll say, yeah, that's probably not quite strong enough. You may want to look at increasing that. But we'll assess and say, yes, you are requiring 7-character passwords. So a lot of options there. We're already getting into the complexity of this, just from the get-go of doing the assessment, and it's just going to get more complex from here. So moving along, I got to make sure I'm keeping up with time here. Okay, so we've got the assessment, and we kind of have an idea of how we stack up to guidance that's kind of general, but is very broad and I don't want to say the word complete, but kind of along those lines. It's very good guidance out there. Now let's start building out our security policy for our company. How would we do that? Well, if we have a compliance requirement, then you have a baseline for this already. So if you're a healthcare organization that works with protected health information, then you already have HIPAA that provides you specific requirements for securing digital data under the security rule. You also have additional requirements that says how you can share it under the privacy rule. So you kind of tie those security and privacy together a little bit there. If you take payment cards like credit cards or debit cards, then you have some form of PCI requirement there. If you are using a, something like a Clover device or Square or something along those lines, then you have a lot less requirements. But if you've built out an application that has a payment module in it or something like that, you might have a fairly hefty set of requirements levied on you by the payment card industry or PCI. So those are kind of the two big ones that we see around the state working with different clients, but also there's a whole lot of other ones like CMMC. If you're a defense contractor, then you have some CMMC requirements looming over you. Those may not matter at all. If you are a government contractor, but you operate chow halls on Army bases, then well, CMMC is probably not going to affect you in any way. However, if you make components of fighter jets or even cargo planes or passenger planes, then there's a much more high likelihood that CMMC is going to affect you. There's a kind of a growing cadre of financial industry rules, like the SEC is in the process of publishing some a little bit more extensive rules on how to protect data in investment firms. GLBA's Graham Leach Bliley, SOX is Sarbanes-Oxley. Both of these have some very minimal requirements, but they do tell you to do a few things to protect the integrity of data. And they also kind of give you a very generic, have a protective plan in place. New York State is one of the first states to kind of go out on their own and start to do these. If you have any services or products in New York State in the finance or insurance industries, then you have New York State Part 500 to adhere to. If you work in the electric transmission or distribution industry, then you have NERC-CIP to follow. So these are a lot of physical security rules, but they've also over the years been integrating a lot of cybersecurity rules in those as well. So the compliance requirement side of this would gives you a lot of different ways to kind of base some stuff that's already required. You know, you absolutely have to do this by either law or by some participatory requirement. So like HIPAA's a law, CMMC is a contractual requirement, SEC, GLBA, and SOX are all laws. PCI, you have to do that. They say it's voluntary, but you have to do it if you want to take credit cards or debit cards. So it's not really voluntary, but it's not a law. It's a requirement by the industry. If you don't adhere to that, then places like Visa or MasterCard aren't going to let you play in their games. So if you have any of these kind of requirements, and there are a ton more out there too, and there's even things that your partners will levy on you, like Walmart. If Walmart gives you any data, they have Walmart's rules that you have to follow if they give you anything that they consider Walmart data. So there's all sorts of stuff that you can kind of take here and build from. There's also voluntary compliance requirements like a SOC 1, SOC 2. You know, service-oriented controls is what this is, and it's a creation of the accounting industry. And I'll hold my tongue on my feelings about that, but there's a lot of people in the finance world that see this and kind of latch onto it. And so it's, you know, I say it's voluntary, but in some cases, you know, if you don't have something like this, you're not going to be able to do business with certain people. And then internationally, and that's actually not IEEE, that's ISO, International Standards Organization. But I've had IEEE on my mind quite a bit lately for some reason. But that's ISO 27001, and this is a voluntary compliance internationally. Both of these, 27001 and SOC, are a little bit more on the management side, you know, kind of how you have infrastructure in place to manage security. And they assume if you have this infrastructure in place and you can demonstrate your compliance with your policies and processes, that the technical security will follow. But both of these are, you know, somewhat voluntary and kind of go to building up your business as being capable of offering services in a secure manner. And so there's a kind of a little bit before we get into that last section. I do want to kind of hit on, there's a sort of a double-edged sword. If you have these framework requirements, if you have these compliance requirements, then you have it a little easier in one way in that you know what you need to implement, but you have it a little bit more difficult in a couple of ways. So with a compliance requirement, you know what you have to implement. You're being told, and you can take that and you can implement that within your business. But the two sides of that are those compliance frameworks are one size fits all. And some of them are worse than others. HIPAA is absolutely terrible. It is just garbage at this point. Even so much so that the people who enforce HIPAA that have been given a little leeway to do with it as they require have basically said, look, we don't care if you've checked all the HIPAA boxes for compliance. If you're not doing real security, we're going to come take your money, and we have the authority to do that because the Congress gave us that authority. Well, the Congress also wrote those compliance requirements long ago, and they are codified in law. So they literally take an act of Congress to change. But things like PCI, they're written by an industry group that has been very responsive at updating these things. And the controls themselves are actually fairly good and fairly up to date. But then you get into things like CMMC, where it's the Department of Defense, kind of a notoriously stodgy organization. And I say that as a former member, but they're just notoriously stodgy and slow, and they don't understand the idea of small. So the DoD, I always joked, I used to work for the largest employer in the galaxy, which is the Department of Defense, you know, millions and millions of employees. So that does not turn on a dime. And then you have things like SEC, GLBA, and SOX. While they're kind of going in the right direction, they're still very hands-off, and they don't want to put any strong requirements out there because they think they would hinder business. So even with those, you don't have a lot to go on. So even with those, you still have to look at those and take those with a grain of salt and make sure they work well within your company. And you have to you have to take some controls that might not be useful, and you just have to implement them anyway to get that check in the box. On the flip side of that, these may not go to complete a good feeling that your organization is secure. So you might have to take these and build them out even further. It's not a end all be all kind of deal there either way. The flip side of that, when you don't have a compliance requirement, that means you get to choose all of your own stuff, which is a burden in and of itself, because then you have the feeling that, am I doing enough? And then if you have that feeling and that's constantly nagging at you, you might go and take that too far and implement a lot of what I was talking about when I mentioned draconian requirements in the first set of slides. So it's a kind of a battle either way. But if you do have no compliance requirement, then you have a lot better options for implementing just what you need, not too much and not too little. But again, you probably want to have somebody come in and help you determine what you truly need to implement to make sure that these controls and this policy is doing enough for you, not too much, not too little. And when we talk about that, the sources for that, you don't build those, even if you have no compliance requirement, you don't build those from scratch. Let's take the wheel, instead of reinventing it, let's just make it better. And so we do that with any number of frameworks, but the two that we recommend are NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls. You'll see it called controls or CSC quite often. And you can take those, and when you use those, you can build those however you want to make sure they meet your needs. So you have a lot more leeway, but the burden is more on you. Okay, and I can't see if there's any questions or not. So if anybody has any, feel free to speak up. All right, and so first, let's kind of do a little walkthrough of these frameworks. First, we'll dive into the NIST cybersecurity framework, and we call it cybersecurity framework just kind of as a colloquial name for it, but it's really called the Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. This was created from the requirements in an executive order in 2013 by then President Obama. Each president since President Bush has come out with a couple of executive orders that have been cybersecurity focused. President Obama's were very much, let's get cybersecurity out of the government. Let's get this expertise out of the government and let's start working on critical infrastructure. So it was kind of the pivot of we only have purview over government computers, government information systems, and let's try to pivot that out. So we know we can't enforce a lot of things externally as strongly as we do internally, but we can provide the resources to help those critical infrastructure organizations secure themselves. And that's what this document is. It was published by National Institute of Standards and Technologies, which is like the Library of Alexandria for cybersecurity stuff. The special publications and a lot of their other documents are just a wealth of guidance that are developed by very, very smart people that work for NIST and industry leaders. They take a lot of input from a lot of other people. When I used to work at MITRE, we were asked to consult on some of the core documents, and we actually put a lot of work into one of their penetration testing guideline documents as well. So if you look in there, I look at all these and I can go back and look at the people who are contributing from MITRE, and it's like, oh, I worked with her, worked with him, worked with her, worked with him kind of thing. So there's a lot of very smart people who are plugged into these. And then they also draw on, they have questions and comment periods and stuff like that. Right now we're in a comment period for version 2.0 of this, or a kind of an information gathering period for that. So they're working on the next version of this. But this framework and this set of controls are very, very good to build your plan off of. And so when we talk about controls, we kind of dive into this, and there's different aspects. And what you're seeing now is kind of a table of contents sort of chart. And we're not even at the control level yet. We're talking about functions, which is kind of a timeline of a breach, where we can look at identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so identify is kind of the function that says, let's figure out what you have. Let's set up your program and everything. Protect is, let's put those protective controls and measures in place. So let's run firewalls. Let's run antivirus. Let's lock down password strength. Let's implement encryption and things like that. So that's kind of what most people think about when they think about security, is that protect function. But that's not everything. So years ago, we kind of realized that, well, we're not going to be able to prevent everything. So we need to be able to detect when things nefarious happen, or things unusual at the least. And so we have detective controls where we're monitoring things. We're looking at logs. We're watching firewall net flow data and things like that. And so that would feed into a response. So maybe we detect something that looks out of place. We need to respond to that by determining, okay, how do I triage these? How do I determine if this is truly nefarious or just something unusual? And then how do we clean up any messes that we find? How do we contain any flaws? Some of that, kind of the cleanup messes would go into recover, but things like containment, how do I prevent an incident from becoming more than it could? So think about things like, if you have detective controls in place and you can respond to things and adequately, then you might be able to prevent a breach from becoming catastrophic if you catch it and react in time. However, if you don't know what's going on at all and you don't know anything happened until 3 years later, it's probably going to be as worse as it possibly could be. So we want to be able to detect these within a reasonable amount of time. We want to be able to respond to them appropriately, so that we have less damage to recover from, and we have more likelihood that we can actually recover the company. The big thing there is that you'll see a lot of news items where they talk about how that, oh yeah, so-and-so, Experian, Target, whoever had a breach and they're recovering from it. Well, you don't hear that in a lot of small businesses, because if a small business has a breach, they're more likely to tank than a large business is. Large business has a lot of resources that they can use to recover. Small businesses don't. Okay, so looking inside of these different categories, you'll notice on the left we've got protect, and then we've got the identity management, authentication, and access control family. And then we dive into the individual controls. So PR.AC-1 is the individual control itself. So that one says identities and credentials are issued, managed, verified, revoked, audited for authorized devices, users, and processes. So this basically says we have a firm handle on assigning accounts and the privileges that are associated with those accounts, to the roles that go along with those. We excuse me, we have a process for assigning accounts when we have new workforce members. We have a process for periodically reviewing the accesses granted to them and making sure they are appropriate. And we have a process for removing those accounts and accesses when either changes happen, such as termination or a transfer or something like that. So we've got kind of a mix of processes here. We've got a mix of some technical controls as well. And we can take this and we can see this is kind of high level, a little bit nebulous. So this is where it's helpful to have somebody who understands what these mean to help you determine how do we create some direct and to the point requirements for my organization in this. And then the NIST cybersecurity framework does a really good job about showing how we're not just pulling these out of thin air and kind of doing them for our own gratification, but they reference all these other all these other control frameworks or compliance requirements in here. So CIS-CSC, Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. This references the next document that we'll look at here. And then some other ones, COBIT, ISA, ISO 27001. Remember, we referenced that earlier. But then in the bottom here, NIST Special Publication 800-53. This is pretty much the granddaddy of all control frameworks. And this is what the executive branch of the federal government enforces upon itself. The NIST cybersecurity framework can be viewed as being directly derived from NIST Special Publication 800-53. There's something like 500 controls in this, and it gets way, 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 way into the weeds. That's nothing that you ever want to have to do. Thousands of pages in this document here. And there's even a revision since then. There's a revision 5 out, but that covers every government agency from the Department of Defense to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So it's way deeper than anybody needs to be. So you can thank the government thank NIST for creating this cybersecurity framework document that takes it, simplifies it a lot for you to take into place or for you to take in and use for your own benefit. And so here, we talked about the protect function, the identity management, authorization, and access control family, and then the PRAC-1 control itself. When we're talking about the NIST, the Center for Internet Security, critical security controls, it looks a little bit different. And so this has 18 controls. And they look like this. So the controls for this, what CIS considers a control, I would consider a family. So there's a little bit of kind of disjointed nature in how we talk about this. But when we're looking in these, we've got 18 controls here. We've got, control 1 is inventory and control of enterprise assets. Control 2, inventory and control of software assets. So kind of the same thing. The control that we just looked at on the NIST cybersecurity framework side, the identities and credentials are issued, managed, so on and so forth, probably better aligns down here under control 05 with account management. And we can drill into that a little bit more, but let's talk a little bit about what these controls look like kind of from an organizational standpoint. So we have the 18 controls, which I would say are more control families. Inside those controls, we have safeguards. That's what I would consider the actual controls themselves. So with that, we have, you see here, IG1, IG2, and IG3. Those are called implementation groups. And so there's a definition of kind of where organization should be and which implementation group they should pick at that state in their organization. In this, you can see for each of these controls to say in implementation group 1, 4 of the 6 safeguards are recommended. In IG2, 6 of the 6, and IG3, 6 of the 6. So as you go from IG1 to IG3, you're getting more mature in your security function. And so account management is going to be heavy on the front end because that's a very important kind of foundational thing. But if you look down at audit log management, there's 12 safeguards. Only 3 of those are recommended for implementation group 1. But as you get to IG2 and IG3, that's where we get to 11 and 12, the complete set of those safeguards. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at the CIS controls, that those safeguards are a little bit more analogous to a control itself when we're thinking about this kind of from a bigger picture of things. So it'll be a little bit confusing, but don't get too wrapped around the axle on what somebody's calling these, and kind of look for the content itself. So when we get down into those safeguards, this is where we get a little bit more granularity into there. And so we talked about the maintaining accounts and accesses and stuff in the cybersecurity framework. And so you can see here in CIS Critical Security Control 5.1, establish and maintain an inventory of accounts. So kind of here, we're looking at a similar function there to understand what we have. And so we're kind of doing the very beginning of that part where we have some sort of tracking mechanism. As we create these accounts, we can go document them somewhere so we can come back later and review what's available. Some other things that that might help with this are further down here. Things like centralized account management. If you have one place to look at these accounts, it's going to be much easier to manage. If you're managing your service accounts that aren't necessarily assigned to individuals but are used to connect two different systems together, that's going to clarify a lot of the questions that you might have looking at these accounts later and make it much easier to do that periodic management, periodic review of the accounts that are out there. So a lot of those go together. There's more here. Actually, there's not more here, but there's more controls like this, more safeguards like this under the other major control categories. But as we go kind of to the right here in each of these controls, you can see there's a security function there. Notice how those align with the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover functions that we looked at in the NIST cybersecurity framework kind of table of contents section very early on. And remember when I said that the NIST document it isn't just kind of pulled out of thin air. It references a lot of industry standards. Well, this CIS document does as well. So all of these tie together. They're all kind of meant to be complementary, but they're meant to kind of help in different ways. So we, in my company, long ago, we created kind of a generic set of controls that if a client doesn't have a compliance requirement, then we'll use this set of 42 controls that we've devised that are based very closely on the Center for Internet Security Controls and the NIST cybersecurity framework because they tie together so well. So we kind of take the authority of NIST with the granularity of the Center for Internet Security document, and we make the best of both to build a set of comprehensive but not overly burdensome controls that we will assess and recommend for clients to implement. And also you can see out here where we talked about how the implementation groups, if you remember the safeguard, there were 6 safeguards under account management. 4 of them were in IG1. Well, that's 5.1 through 5.4. But then all 6 of them were in IG2 and IG3. So you can see kind of here that moniker to take the recommendation. Oh, hey, I'm just starting out. I'm going to work on IG1 controls. So I just need these 4 out of there. Oh, I've moved on now. I'm grown. I'm more mature. I want to implement IG2. Okay, so I need to do the 6 out of the account management control. Any questions on that? All right, moving right along. So, from that, we have a whole lot of controls that we can pull from. There are, I want to say, 12 families or so in the cybersecurity framework, and you saw, the controls and Center for Internet Security. There are 18 of them, which kind of equate to the families in themselves. There's a lot of stuff to do here, and a lot of stuff that may not be applicable within your organization. So you want to look through these controls and pick through the ones that are most applicable to you to implement in a kind of a prioritized way, whether you look at cybersecurity framework and pick from there, or whether you take the implementation group recommendations from Center for Internet Security, critical security controls, then you can kind of look through those and you can say, hey, these fit my organizations or these don't. In those, we'll go through the CIS controls here in a minute and kind of walk through those. But think about what is important to you, what is important to your stakeholders, what do they want to see? If you have a financial management company, then privacy of data is probably important to you. So encryption may be important to gain the, or to get that privacy. Other things like, if you have a heavy on-prem presence, like you have servers and workstations and stuff that you're responsible for, then you want to make sure those are patched and managed tightly. So vulnerability management might be very important to you. And everywhere you have accounts, so you probably want to make sure that those accounts aren't just proliferating without any kind of oversight or review. So account management should probably be important to everybody. And all of those will be important to everybody to some level. But you can look at that and go, okay, what's more, what's less important within my organization? And so let's break out of full screen here and flip over to, let's see what I have here. Okay, so here's cybersecurity, sorry, Center for Internet Security controls document. Let me see if I can, that's probably good there. So we're looking through this, and as we go down, there's table of contents. I'm going to flip through this fairly quickly and just kind of scroll down. You should see where we have that nice graphic that I pulled up here a minute ago. There's a lot of extra verbiage in here. First off, you can look at this and you can kind of read the verbiage that they recommend on the implementation groups. Probably a good one to start there. But as we get into these controls, I think I just got to grab that graphic off of the website. Let's scroll back up to the table of contents real quick. So table of contents, as we're going into each individual control, we can look at these and go, okay, control number one, inventory and control of enterprise assets. Okay, that's probably a good idea to have. I have computers. I need to track those, make sure I understand what I have. Inventory and control of software assets. Yeah, I use software. I probably want to know that as well. And then so on and so forth. Data protection, I've got data protect. I want to make sure that my stuff is configured securely. Need to manage accounts, yeah. Need to manage access. Vulnerability management, yeah, that's important. I want to make sure things are patched. Audit log management, yeah, it's important, but I might not be there yet. Email and web browser protections, yeah, I use both of those. Malware, scrolling. Kind of agreeing to all those tacitly, but then I get down to application software security. And I think, I wonder what that means. Let's dig into that a little bit. So double click on that. Let's say manage application and software security means that I need to manage the security lifecycle of in-house developed, hosted, and acquired software to prevent, detect, and remediate security weaknesses before they can impact the enterprise. Well, let's kind of break that down. So I need to protect manage the life cycle of one in-house developed software. Well, I don't develop any in-house software. So let's just X that one out right there. Hosted. All right, this is where, if you have somebody who is knowledgeable about this, you can kind of break down what it means to have hosted software. Hosted software is not Office 365. It's not QuickBooks Online. It is, I am acquiring the Microsoft Exchange server from Microsoft, and I'm going to run that internally in my organization. Or I am running QuickBooks Desktop internally in my organization. And so that's more of a hosted or acquired software. So let's say I'm not running any software in-house. I do everything in the cloud. I use Google Workspace. All my documents are in Google. And I'm not running any servers. So I don't see that this applies to me. And so you might look at that and go, I'm not doing anything with software in this case. I'm only using services. And okay, so I'm not too terribly worried about this. So I'm not going to concern myself with Control 16. I don't need to spin my wheels trying to figure out what I need to do to implement this. I don't need to make up any rules to simply say I'm doing it to check a box, because all of this is within my own. I get to determine what I'm doing here because I don't have any requirements. So I think that control 16 is not applicable to me in any way, shape, or form, so I'm going to ignore that. All right, so let's move your non-faces over there. Let's scroll back up to the top. I hope nobody's getting airsick looking at me scrolling here. So back down to where we were. We looked at control 16. We determined that that doesn't have an application. That doesn't have any requirements that I would need or any guidance that I would need to implement there. So now down to 17, incident response management. Okay, this is like an emergency plan. If there's an incident, I need to have something, and in case of incident, break glass sort of plan so that I'm not running around like a headless chicken when something is on fire, and I want to have a solid plan that I put together at a time where I wasn't panicked to go through and calmly and completely and efficiently handle an incident. Probably a good idea. Okay, so penetration testing. Let's look down at that. I kind of think about that. My network, I don't have an office. We're completely a remote organization, and we use cloud-based tools that are all, vendor source selected, and we put a lot of effort into selecting those sources. But why would I want to do a penetration test? Well, let's look at that control. Test the effectiveness and resiliency of enterprise assets through identifying and exploiting weaknesses and controls and simulating the objectives and actions of an attacker. So again, with someone out there who understands the industry to make these recommendations, you might look at this and go, well, I don't have infrastructure. So I don't have any kind of base company network to try to attack. I have workstations. So I might need to test something there. And I have people. I might need to test something there. But those aren't necessarily what a penetration test would test. In this case, you might test those people with more phishing evaluations and things like that. You might, those workstations, you might not even be able to test those appropriately just due to the nature of having a remote workforce. So you might look at this penetration testing control and say, I don't fall under traditional understanding of how penetration tests are done. So this isn't anything I would necessarily implement in the form that it states here. However, I do want to test my people through phishing tests via email, text message, and phone, if that's possible. And I want to test my workstations through some other means to ensure that we are configured correctly and patched. So I might determine that I need a vulnerability management solution in place with this. And that might not necessarily fit under penetration testing as much as that would fit under the vulnerability management control that we passed by continuous vulnerability management, control 7. So I might pull that under control 7 and say that's a little bit more appropriate under something like that. So I might throw out that penetration testing control completely as not applicable, but ensuring I'm covering what I feel like I need to cover under another control. So that's 16 of the 18 controls your organization may have looked at and said, hey, this is what we need to do within our organization. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. So kind of the point I'm trying to get across there is like when you have free reign, you also have the burden of picking out what's important and leaving behind what's not important to you. And that's where it's very important to have somebody who knows what they're talking about. They can advise you, okay, this is, mostly not applicable in your organization, but you still need to consider this, or this is wholly not applicable, because there's a ton of security controls out there, and the whole one size fits all mentality of the people who write these are trying to make it everyone or everything to everyone. And so you might not have these functions in your organization at all, which would make trying to implement those controls a burden on your company for no real risk management benefit. So you've got to be careful when you're looking at these and how you're doing that. All right, so back to the slides. Now, when we're looking at these, we've picked out the controls that we want. So let's say we're just going with looking at the CIS critical security controls. And we say, hey, we've picked out that we want all but 16 and 18. So we're going to implement 16 of the 18, leaving the application security and the penetration test ones out because those aren't applicable. Well, now let's look at those controls and let's make them very pointed for our specific implementation. So for our organization, we want them to be very fitting, and so that we're not just have some generic control that's we feel good because we wrote it, but it looks like a Shakespearean sonnet. We want that to be direct and to the point and very applicable in our organization. So we might combine multiple controls, like the CIS 1 and 2, the inventory for hardware and the inventory for software. We've combined those to say inventory. And so we kind of break those down and say that we have to maintain an inventory, or our client organizations should maintain an inventory of the hardware they use, as well as the software packages that they use. And so that helps them put that all together. It's not overly burdensome of having two separate controls for tracking, but we just take one major control and create two sub-controls under that. So similar, but it looks less complex. Also simplify the language. This is probably even more important here. We would say things like, full disk encryption must be enabled for all laptop computers. We might underscore that by saying, Windows computers must have BitLocker enabled, and must have that enrolled, through a group policy object or something like that, a technical control, a technical way of doing that. But at the same time, we also might have a sub portion of that control that says all new computers must be purchased with a TPM 2.0 or greater chip, so that we know that we can implement that encryption with little hindrance of hardware limitations. So other ones, we might enforce multi-factor authentication, and we would say specifically that it must be enforced for all cloud-based applications and VPN connections. So anything that is accessible over the internet must have multi-factor authentication. And then under each of those, we might say something like the WatchGuard router, the WatchGuard VPN service must have auth point enabled, and two-factor or multi-factor must be accomplished primarily through software tokens on smartphones and only via text message if no other means are available, or something along those lines. We want to be very directive in this too. Like I said, we don't want this to be a Shakespearean sonnet. We don't want these and thous and things like that. We want this will be done. This is how it will be done, things like that. So you want to be straight and to the point when you're doing this, and you want to be directive. We see a lot of policies that were written kind of where we pull in a client and we look at what they have in place, and it is very fluffy, and it's talking about the whys and all this kind of stuff. That's not what policy is for. Policy is to be directive. Policy is to say, this is what you are doing. You don't need to say why. You are the authority. It doesn't matter at that point. If somebody says, well, why are you doing this? Be like your mom, because I'm mom. And I say so because I'm your parent and I say so, kind of thing. You get the buy-in, the company leadership, the company owner, whatever, says this is how it's going to be, and that's how it's going to be. The fact that you've based this on things like Center for Internet Security Controls and NIST Cybersecurity Framework, that's your why. If you reference that in there, then you can go back and look and say, look, this is industry best practices. So that's why we do this. So let's look at we've got a template in here, and we're going to run a little bit over time. So I hope you guys have a little bit of extra time. I'm doing way better than last time. But we've got a template in here that I think the Forge folks can share for creating this. And I call it a template, but it's really not. It's really more of a framework. See if I can get rid of that. Perfect. So I think, Dugan, I don't know if you can share this or not with the group, but I'd appreciate it if you did in a PDF format or something like that. But the one thing I want to stress is that this is not Mad Libs. You know, this is not a go and fill in the blank kind of deal. You want to create this to be your own thing. It needs to be concise, to the point, and direct when you're doing this. So we don't like to have Mad Libs because every organization is different. But kind of the way we break this down is, you know, one of the big things is this has to be a living document. So I always put a revision history in here where you can put the date and the notes of what was revised. You can put an approval column in here if you want. But then we get into some of the background, you know, why are we doing this? What does the organization do? Who is its clients? You're given a structure so that if I'm coming in as an auditor or an assessor, I can read this and understand your thought process a little bit better about why the things that follow are the way they are. Purpose, this is a little boilerplate, but you can take it and adapt it as you need. I generally have found that every policy or process document has a purpose section in it to kind of give an understanding of that. If you didn't understand what the words cybersecurity and policy meant, then you could read that purpose and get there. Scope, we talked about this already. This kind of outlines what you understand as the breadth and depth of your requirements are. Threats, this is at a threat assessment we talked about. This is a copy directly from one of our clients who's a financial management client. This is one that came out of an assessment that we give them kind of the seeds to build upon. We take, you know, what kind of data they have, the threat actors that we believe are targeting that have that specific motivation, and then the potential threat vectors or ways they would carry out attacks. Roles and responsibilities are very important. This is one of those things that you'll see in a lot of more compliance requirements where it says there needs to be a buck stops here assignment. And so this is where you say, hey, this is the final authority on all security within the business. This is the person who's responsible for doing it. This is the person who's leading it. This is the person who's responsible for making decisions. And this is the person that we throw the book at when something goes wrong. Not really, but this is the person we talk to when something goes wrong. And then under the risk management section is where I start laying out the controls. And this is where we're doing we're dictating what we say needs to be done within the organization. And so the access control ones here, we're talking a lot more about processes. So the information technology department will develop and maintain an onboarding process, yada, 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 yada. Has some other specific things in there. But also note that we reference NIST in there. So like I said, we reference NIST quite a bit in what we do. You may reference the Center for Internet Security Controls. It's very similar to this. But we reference that in there as the why we're doing this. You know, we've anchored this to a industry best practices document. So in the access control, as we talked about when I first started this, you know, we'll develop and maintain an onboarding process. The next sub-control, we'll develop and maintain a periodic review of all granted accesses and ensure continued need and applicability. That's the review occasionally to make sure that everything is still the way it should be. And then the information technology department will develop and maintain an offboarding process. So that's the termination side. So there's the life cycle of your accounts. One little add-in down here, a lot of times the HR department and the IT department are not connected in any way, shape, or form. So you do have to make that declaration that HR is going to work with IT. Sometimes it's a throw it over the fence. Sometimes the IT people are just like, hey, nobody ever tells us anything. So when accounts are being created, you'll often see that connection works just fine. But when employees are leaving, IT department is usually the last place to know. So you want to make sure that that's in there. Identity and access management. Now we're talking a little bit more technical controls here. So again, we referenced the NIST control that we're using here. It says where possible, all systems will be configured to require passwords to be, and then a whole slew of technical requirements for those passwords. Multi-factor authentication will be implemented on all internet accessible services. These required services include Office 365, VPN, QuickBooks Online, ... So you fill those in as you use it. Multi-factor will be configured to use a smartphone app where possible as a first option, and text message as a second option. So we're creating stipulations, we're being very direct here, and we're giving very specific things that'll be done. So this is kind of a guide on getting this document started. This document's going to be much longer. Your controls specifically for these, like access control and identity and access management, don't have to be this in depth. You can write them however you want, but that's kind of why I say this is not Mad Lib's fill in the blank. This is just framework for you to write your own stuff in. Okay, I see Dugan on, so I think I'm about to get the shepherd's crook off the stage here, but I'm going to finish finish the last handful of slides here. There's not that many left. So we talked about writing the policy. Now let's talk about implementing the policy. Technical controls, you probably understand. I need to go by the configuration. I need to install some software. I need to set a setting or something like that. Fairly easy. Process controls, you need to go write a process, but there's also the enforcement aspect of this. Technical controls are enforced by default. You know, you said if a password has to be 12 characters by configuration, then the computer is not going to let somebody come through with a 8-character password or a 2-character password. Process controls, though, require supervisors and managers to enforce those processes. Physical controls are kind of a mix of both. You know, we can install locks, and if you have a key lock, if you have a proxy card lock, it's going to work the same way every time to let somebody in. However, Dugan can leave the door open and let Chris in somewhere that Lee or Scott doesn't want Chris to be, and you have effectively, you know, kind of broken that physical control that way. Cameras can watch all sorts of things, but if nobody's looking at them at the appropriate time, what's the point? Alarms the same way. They can be there if they're not being set. What use are they? So it's kind of a mix of both of those there. You have to have the enforcement to make sure that the technical side of things works. And then finally, we want to test and update. So we want to assess the success for each control. And this is where we get those follow-on audits or assessments. Those can be internal, those can be external. And then we want to determine the risk of these. There's a couple of ways to do this. We can do a subjective measure of risk where we say, what's the likelihood of this control being, or this, you know, something bad happening? And then if that something bad happened, what would be the impact? So if the likelihood is high and the impact is high, the overall risk is high. If the likelihood is low and the impact is low, the overall risk is probably low. But if you've got like a low likelihood and a high impact, you've got to meet in the middle somewhere with maybe a moderate. Subjective is very good if you have somebody who knows what they're doing, who understands security and looks at it with a lot of other examples and kind of background knowledge. If you need something that's more objective, you can use something like Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which is a calculator that tells you what the vulnerability severity is, which we can somewhat associate with risk based on kind of the vulnerability itself, the implementation within your organization, and the difficulty of compromising that within your organization. There's different portions of this, and there's online calculators for that. If you've ever run something like Nessus, like a vulnerability scanner, you've probably seen the CVSS base score in there and references to the temporal and the environmental components of that. But the problem with that is it works well for technical vulnerabilities, not so well for other vulnerabilities. So each, the subjective and the objective options, have their own pros and cons there. So just know that. But that's another reason having somebody who's deeply knowledgeable about risk management is very important as you grow into your maturity of your security program. And then reviewing and update these. Most recommendations are to review your plans at least annually, and also if you make major changes in your business. And so those major changes may be, I've doubled in size, I've moved locations, I've expanded my geographic footprint, things like that. Things that you want to review is, how is the threat landscape changed? Is security different? Are the threats different this year than they were last year? And how have I adapted my controls to that? Has my organization changed? Again, have I grown? Have I moved? Have I expanded? How has your technology changed? Did I switch? Have I migrated to the cloud from on-prem? Have I gotten more centralized control over certain software as a service offerings? Have I done anything different? Have I switched from Google to Microsoft, Microsoft to Google, something like that? How is all of that changed within there? And make sure that your policy document reflects those changes. And I think that is all.